Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Lifestyle Mastery, and to make Sarah Dusek, who's the general partner of Enygma Ventures, which is a newly founded venture capital fund focused on investing in female founders and entrepreneurs in Southern Africa. Sarah was a co-founder of Under Canvas, the leading US adventure hospitality company offering luxurious glamping accommodations just minutes away from America's most popular and iconic national parks. Sarah is an alumni of Manchester University. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Awesome. So you have an interesting journey. You're British. You started in the UK, but you built a large company and had a great exit in the US and now in Africa. How did you get into this crazy world of startups?
By accident. So I never intended to be an entrepreneur, and I don't think the idea of being an entrepreneur really ever crossed my mind. But I definitely always thought of myself as a pioneer, someone who wanted to go where no one else had been before, and break new ground. I just had never I connected the dots with the concept of entrepreneurship, which means I didn't get any input while I was at school that this might be something that I might be interested in. But I started my career working for nonprofits, and I consider myself to be a save the world person. Was wanting to do good and make people's lives better and generally make a difference in the world. And so when the idea of going into business came up, I really thought about business as being the dark side, like the evil side of the empire was this whole concept of making money. So I've come a long way since those days.
Got it. Interesting. And from the world of nonprofits, how did you and what made you start Under Canvas, which is a premier glamping company? How did that come into picture?
Yes, we after sort of 8 years of almost a decade of working at nonprofits, I was burnt out, worn out, frustrated, and really went back to the drawing board with thinking like, what's next? I had a quarter life crisis. I was in my late 20s. And was really sort of searching for, if I'm not going to work for NGOs anymore, and I'm not going to go back and work in far-flung places around the world, what am I going to do? And I started to sort of wrestle with this idea that maybe that NGOs are not the vehicle for driving change and driving innovation and moving the world forward, and that maybe the vehicle for doing that actually is business, because business exists to solve a problem, and they have to be sustainable because they have to make money to continue to exist. And ideally, they're always solving a problem of some kind. That's the very nature of being business. You innovate to solve a problem, and you do it in a sustainable way that people will pay you for your services or your products, and you keep doing what you're doing. So I started to really wrestle with this idea that could business be a force for good in the world? Could business be a vehicle for driving change and creating innovations that solve big world systemic problems? And so I went back to the drawing board and went and did his master's degree and wrestled with these thoughts some more and came to the conclusion that I think it could be. And if that was true, and I wanted to do some good in the world, then maybe my next step was to go into business. So not having a degree in business or having any background in business, my husband and I launched a very small company. Our first company we launched in the UK, actually, as I'm British. And my husband and I recently got married, and it was an utter failure. It was a disaster. As often, businesses often fail, right, for a number of reasons. And the great financial crash rolled around in 2007, 2008, and we got caught up in the middle of that and couldn't survive through it. And so our first business quickly came to an end during that era and that big recession. But we didn't give up. We decided that no, we think there's something here. We just haven't found the right thing yet, and that didn't work. So let's give it another go. So we upped sticks. We moved to the States. My husband's American, so we moved back to Montana, where he is from, and started our business, which ultimately became Under Canvas, which ultimately became very successful. But it was certainly on the back of a massive failure before that.
Interesting. And yeah, a couple of interesting things you talked about. You got frustrated with nonprofits. Early in my career, I was fascinated by nonprofits coming from India, but I found it to be very corrupt. But what were your thoughts? Why were you frustrated with nonprofits?
Yeah, I was frustrated because I felt like the change I wanted to make in the world wasn't happening fast enough. And I felt like a lot of the work that I was doing was not addressing the root issue of any of the problems that we were, effectively tackling. And my first job was in Zimbabwe, and we were doing AIDS education and health awareness for young people across the country. And I don't know that we made any difference in solving the AIDS crisis whatsoever. and I just, after 8 years of work like that, and certainly very meaningful, working in some very difficult places, I just felt like I think there's something more. I think there's another way, and obviously we've improved the AIDS crisis drastically over the last 30 years. Haven't solved it for sure, but there has been some change. But I just felt like the work I was doing was not getting to the root of any real problem. So the vehicle that I had was more like a bandaging entity that would prop people up, help people in immediate need, and try and do some good. But we just weren't tackling anything meaty. And I feel like we should try and find solutions to big problems. And I think that's possible. I just don't know that working in this way is the right vehicle, especially because nonprofits suffer from, they rely on outside sources to fund them, to keep them alive. And if your project is no longer sexy, funding's getting diverted to something else, the next sexy thing on the block. And so there's no time and no real way to do anything than provide emergency relief. And that's, maybe what aid does really well, is provide emergency relief, but doesn't necessarily solve any big crises. So for me, I felt like I potentially needed a different vehicle if I was going to contribute to anything that might drive some long-term change.
Yeah, interesting. And you did also mention about your first startup. You started with your husband. I'm married. I run a small publishing business with my wife, and it's always difficult to separate personal and professional life. And if there's a failure of a startup, it does affect you in a way. How did you balance the relationship, and how did what are some of your learnings on how can you work together with your partner?
Yeah, I've been in business now with my husband for 17 years, and we've been married 17 years. And certainly the early years of our marriage were rough. I think the challenge, I think there are pros and cons of working with your spouse. The very huge pros are you have somebody in the trenches with you who understands it completely and utterly, and you can share everything and hopefully complement each other's skill sets in very different ways. My husband and I are very different from each other, complement each other very well, and have different strengths and different weaknesses. And I think that's a huge plus. And I actually, now in the work that I do now, I see many successful couples working together in a really, really great way. And I love investing in couples, and I love seeing couples in business together. The challenges, of course, are that your work is always with you. So you never, the clocking on and clocking off is never quite as clean as when you go to work and your work is separate from your family, and it's there, it's with you. We will be in bed at night often talking about things that we're worried about or concerned about, or things we've got to fix, and it's hard to switch off. So creating balance is probably one of the biggest challenges with being married to your partner in business as well as in life. But I would say I personally think the pros outweigh the cons, especially if you can learn to lever each other's strengths and recognize this is my dance space and this is your dance space, and here's how we overlap in the middle, because then you're a powerhouse, and then that's really powerful.
Super interesting. And you went on to sell under canvas for around $100 billion. What was the process, and why did you want to sell a company and start your own fund?
We definitely didn't go out to sell our company. It wasn't on our agenda particularly, but we were trying to grow and scale a really large business. So when we finally launched our business under canvas in 2009, we had a couple of years of trying to figure out our perfect business model. And in 2012, we really sort of landed on the business model that exists today. And under canvas now builds and operates large-scale glamping resorts around the national parks in the US, and is the largest glamping company of its kind. And when we finally realized what we'd created, we realized we could scale it. So we had a vision to scale and grow our business in an exponential way. But when we ultimately sold our business, or sold the majority of our business, we were just out to raise more capital to put in the business to help it grow. But we got an offer that really would have been crazy to have turned down. So we took it and sold the control of our company, and we still own a piece of under canvas, and we still sit on the board and still very involved. But the day-to-day operations of under canvas shifted away from us and onto new ownership.
Interesting. And I want to talk about Enygma Ventures, where the focus is on Southern Africa. Why is the thesis focused on Southern Africa? Since you worked most of the time in the UK and US, and why is the focus on female founders?
Yeah, well, I started my career working for NGOs in Africa.
Oh,
it was the beginning of my journey, and fell in love with Africa then. And retrospectively, under canvas really was recreating the African safari experience in the US by creating tented camps. So Africa has definitely been very good to us. But when we decided we would, after selling our company, that we would launch a venture capital fund, one of the things that was important to both of us was that we lever ourselves for the most good. So when we thought about how we might use our capital and potentially raise more capital for a venture capital fund, when we looked at the opportunities that existed, we looked at Africa again and saw there's Africa's woefully underfunded, entrepreneurs are woefully undersupported, and that potentially we could lever our experience of growing and scaling a business to help others and provide capital, and particularly to invest in women. And I'm super passionate about women climbing the ranks, creating wealth, creating diversity amongst the people who have power, and i.e. the people who have wealth. And so for us to get involved in Women in Africa felt like a full circle moment. And so that's what we did in 2019, and we're 3 years in now.
So super interesting. And it's been recently announced that Serena Williams is going to retire, and she got a $100 million fund where she focuses on investing into diversity, especially into female founders, and she realized that only 2% of the venture capital goes into female founders, and that's a perspective I want to understand from a female VC. Why is it that only across the ecosystems, be it Asia, Europe, US, why is it that only 2 to 5% of the money goes into female founders, and why there's so much of less representation of female founders or women in the boards of these startups and companies?
Yeah, it's a crazy stat that in terms of less than 2% of all venture capital is going to women. It's hardly a believable stat, really, but it's unfortunately woefully true. And that was the reason for us to focus on investing in women. My own journey of raising capital was exceptionally hard. I think the reason for it, in simple terms, is there are so few women investors. 99% of all, and maybe it's not 99%, but it's high, of all VCs are men. And the VC world, the investment world, has largely been dominated by a certain subset of people who've had access to wealth, who maybe went to a particular set of schools, who maybe then networked with a particular set in society, who tended to invest in people like them. And that has perpetuated itself for 30 to 40 years. I think the idea of venture capital is about 50 years old. And, it's been this club, a boys' club, dominated by white men who went to a certain, prestigious school, which has in my opinion, really damaged. I mean, anytime you've not got diversity, it damages the outcome, right? Because what it creates is a monolithic expression of, or something's created or something's funded that is one viewpoint. And when you've not got many viewpoints being funded, we end up with an unequal, not very diverse and world, which is what we've got, right? And we've still got a lot of white supremacy in the mix, and we've still got a very high concentration of men the world over, but definitely white men controlling the world's wealth.
Right.
And that means people suffer ultimately, and the world that we build increasingly just becomes more unequal. And so it's a stat we've got to change. It's a stat that we've got to work very hard at to undo, and to proactively focus on investing in women and people of colour, because that's how we're going to build a better world, in my view. That's how we're going to build a world that's more accessible and more equal for all, and creates opportunities for all. And one of the things about moving to America, and obviously I moved as a British person, married to an American, moving to an America, the opportunities that still exist in the United States are extraordinary. And the idea of the American dream, where everybody potentially can make it, which obviously is not really true, but the idea that everybody has equal access to making money and starting a new life and building a new world is an incredible idea. And I think the more we all work to make that a reality for everybody in our world, we'd see less war, probably have less disease, less strife, less conflict, less division of wealth and power, and access to basic human resources. There's so many things, and so I'm digressing, but diversity is so important. And it's very easy, being white, to think that everything's fine, and it doesn't matter that white men control the world's wealth. The reality is it does matter, and the knock-on effects of it are huge.
Got it. Interesting. And you've been running Enygma for close to around 3 years. What's been the biggest change in your investing style? Especially, we had I think as soon as it started, we had COVID. Now looks like it's a recession. So it's been quite a roller coaster ride in the past 3 years.
Total roller coaster. Yeah, we started investing at the very beginning of the pandemic. So really wild times to A, start a business in, and B, starting investing in startups. And now, of course, hitting another global financial turbulent time. So it's definitely been eye-opening. Luckily, we went into investing with COVID in mind. So that certainly helped in terms of thinking about what will be pandemic proof, what's still going to be important through the pandemic and beyond the pandemic. And I certainly think investors are more and more critical about what really matters now in terms of, thinking about these big, massive global shifts that are happening and seem to be happening, at increasing rates. For us personally, I think on a personal level, I think I have become more aware of just how critical the person is. And I always used to think, and it's easy to think when we all watch Shark Tank or Dragon's Den, that the business idea is what sells it to investors. And yes, the business idea is obviously important, but I think increasingly I am thinking I'd much rather take an average business idea and an outstanding human being who has got so much drive and determination and guts and bravery and, experience and talent than I would have like a knock it out of the park. That's definitely a unicorn. Because A, you never know what's a unicorn, and B, it's people that make unicorns happen. So I think personally, that's just become even more apparent and even more critical that the best ideas in the world can only be executed by talented human beings.
Got it. And the 3 years of investing, what's been your biggest miss, and how did it impact your mindset going forward?
My biggest miss. There's definitely, I have to be careful because people I've invested in are probably listening. I think there are definitely investments, knowing what I know now, I might not have made. But again, I think that has more to do with people and talent and grit and determination rather than the business idea. And certainly there have been a couple of investments that I missed out on and I passed on and I definitely shouldn't have. That's always the case. And you think, I don't really know that's a thing. And then, a year later, they've raised a lot of money, they're going great guns, and you had first chance and you said, no, I don't think that's anything. So that's tough. That's really, really tough. But, at the end of the day, great, I believe, because I have to believe this to be able to do what I do and stay sane, is that great people will always find funding. And that if you're really determined, you'll never take no for an answer, no matter how many chips are stacked against you.
Got it. And do you have any insecurities as an investor, considering there are so many new sectors and new markets which are opening up? Does it lead to any sort of, FOMO concept about any insecurities as an investor?
In terms of region or sectors or all of the
in terms of sectors, especially when it comes to technology, there's so much of new things happening. You don't want to miss out.
Yeah, it's always going to be really hard to pass on a fintech opportunity, particularly in Africa, because fintech services are so underdeveloped. Fintech is probably the fastest growing space in the continent of Africa, with so many people unbanked and so many people not having access to services. There's just so much potential for creating access and helping people level up. Largely Africa is still undigitized. So digitization opportunities are upon us left, right and center, which is really exciting to see, but probably fintech is the most exciting sector for sure.
Yeah, no, I think it's super interesting with the kind of fintech opportunities happening in Africa. I somehow feel like Africa is what India used to be, 20, 30 years back.
100%. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of, Africa feels like the last frontier, if you like, sort of the last undeveloped, place in that sense, with the most sort of underdevelopment of technology. and India is a really good example of that because it leapfrogged ahead,
Yeah.
Wildly over the last 20 years in terms of the service centers and datas and developers and so much technology advancements happening in India, and that has really yet to kick off in Africa, in a huge way. We're just at the very beginning of the iceberg, I think. But yeah, that's pretty much where we're at. So hopefully 20 years time, Africa will look very different than it does today.
Interesting. And when you talk about Southern Africa, is it mostly about South Africa that you focus on, or are there other countries where the interesting, entrepreneurial innovations are?
Yeah, we've invested across Southern Africa, and we just started investing and looking at East Africa this year too.
Okay.
So we've made investments into Zambia, South Africa, Eswatini. But yeah, we'll look across the region for great people with great ideas.
Got it. And especially looks like we could be we are in a financial crunch. But what segment of the market do you think will be hit hardest by this financial crunch? And what are some of the worries which can come with it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we saw last year supply chains hit really, really hard, and that actually hit Africa in really surprising ways, really. Just even, so you realize how much product, or how much even, jars and bottles and containers coming from India, for example, and so much manufacturing not happening on this continent but happening on other continents, and reliant on to finish a product. For certain products need to be imported to be able to finish a product and sell it. So certainly we saw in the last year that just consumer goods, products and services just being whacked because of supply chains, and that being really, really tough. Obviously, global fuel prices are super challenging. That's going to be challenging for a while to come yet, I think, for the continent. And then you've got the knock-on of interest rates. And I think for Africa, and I could definitely be wrong, but Africa's always had a rough end of the stick when it comes to interest rates and access to capital. So I don't know that it will get infinitely worse than it has already been. But it'll certainly be interesting to see further knock-on effects, particularly of rising interest rates in the US. I mean, currency devaluation is the obvious one that creates pressure in other ways for doing business. But in some ways, it'll be, I think Africa may be insulated in some ways from some of the big hikes, just because she has it rough a lot of the time anyway. So I don't know, it will be really interesting to see what happens over the next year.
Got it. And as you mentioned, the VC industry has been there for the last 50 years, but a lot of things have changed. We have got a lot of innovative products like revenue-based financing and voice factoring. But what do you think was most likely to change about venture landscape in next coming years?
In general, globally, or just for Africa?
About Africa.
I am hoping that we'll see more and more capital continue to be poured into the continent, because that's really what the continent needs. And I certainly, in the last year, there's been increased enthusiasm and increased effort for funding startups across the continent. So as we continue to build the momentum of more startups getting funded, hopefully there'll be more follow-on capital coming into the continent to keep funding great businesses. So some big players got brought to the table this last year. SoftBank made its first investment and is writing really big checks. So that's always exciting to see, because it creates confidence. But I feel like Africa's it's the next best thing, if you like, and we're just waiting for everyone to catch on to that fact. But certainly I think there are huge opportunities here on the continent. The scale of the opportunities and the ability to invest on the continent is really exciting. And Africa, in lots of ways, is, particularly Southern Africa, is relatively stable. And there's, you never say never, but I think Africa gets a bad rap for a lot of wrong reasons. And there's a lot of great things and great innovators and great people making really extraordinary things happen. So I'm excited to see more capital and see more people cotton on to the fact that there's a big wide world of opportunities out here.
Interesting. And at the start of the call, before the call, we talked about how business is changing the world. You moved on from non-profits to building your own company and had a huge exit, and now you're running your own VC firm. For the listeners who are trying to start their own business, or they're looking at growth opportunities and how to grow the business, what advice would you give to them, and how can business look at changing changing the world, be it fintech or be it any other industry that they want to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the quick answer to that is solve a problem that you care about. If you care about a problem and you understand the problem that you are trying to solve for you and people like you, we are going to make the world a different place, right? Part of the problem is that problems are only getting solved by certain subsects of society. And we need everyone to look at their world that they are living in and solve the problems that affect you and come up with solutions for making things better. And then if you care about your problem, start testing your ideas, test it out. And, one of the most important things is demonstrating and showing traction. Can you prove that the idea that you've got is needed and wanted and could work? And the fallacy is that you need a lot of money to prove something, right? And the truth is you don't. The truth is most of the time you can beg, borrow and steal, maybe not steal, but from all sorts of sources to try and piece together, even with a technology idea, you don't need to build out a full-blown version of your piece of tech to test it. You basically need a front end, and then everything else you can figure out doing manually on the back end most of the time. And so don't overcomplicate it, is my advice. Keep it simple and try and do it in a small way. Test it out, prove it out, get some momentum, get some more momentum, and keep building on top of the step-by-step approach.
Got it. And again, I quickly want to the top three. What's your favorite business book?
My favorite business book. Who Moved My Cheese? Yeah. It's not really a business book, but it is a business book, but it's about navigating change. And so many of us don't, and I don't even adapt to change very well. But it's one of my favorite books because it tells a little story about two mice who have to get over the idea that the cheese that was in one spot is no longer there, and they have to go find new cheese. And it's a real, it's a great little story. It's like a 20-minute read. It's super easy, but so powerful for helping us wrap our brains around change, innovation, thinking out of the box, finding new pathways, picking ourselves up after we've been, knocked down. And that's the path of the entrepreneur. So I love that book.
We'll put that in the show notes. And Sarah, if you could go back in time when you started Enygma Ventures, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done anything differently?
I don't know that I would have done anything differently, actually. I'm a no regrets person, and I'm a fail fast, fail quick, learn from it. And so learnings, making mistakes are always really, really good. So, anytime you make a mistake or you realize, it would have been better if we'd done that, it's just learning. So learn from it.
Learn from it. Yeah, absolutely love it. Do you have any favorite online tools, example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom?
I'm a big Zoom user. Don't necessarily love it, but I love the fact that we can video call these days. It's amazing. It's incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the product. And so, what is the best way people can reach out to you and know more about Enygma Ventures?
Yeah, you can follow us on Instagram or our Facebook page or on our website, enygmaventures.com. And Enygma is spelled with a Y, ENYGMA, Ventures, VENTURES.com. And follow us for startup advice, conferences, blogs, posts, information on how to build your startup. And we have a whole bunch of learnings for early stage entrepreneurs to help you get funded too.
We'll put that in the show notes. So thank you so much for taking the time and speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.